Hello, I'm Max Truscott, and this is the YouTube version of my top-ranked Aviation News Talk podcast, a weekly show with news and tips for pilots and student pilots to keep you safe. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Last week, the NTSB held a 4-hour meeting about the crash of an Atlas Air 767 that crashed into a bay near Houston last year. Amazingly, everything was going fine until both pilots started making errors, and in just 30 seconds, they plunged from 6,000 feet into the bay. I've edited the 4-hour meeting down to the clips most relevant for GA pilots, and at the end, I'll give you 5 takeaways that all GA pilots can learn from this accident. Please hit subscribe down in the corner so you don't miss next week's show. And now here's our show, starting with the NTSB's Bill English, giving an overview of the accident.
On February 23rd, 2019, at 12:39 Central Standard Time, Atlas Air Flight 3591, a Boeing 767-375 converted freighter, November 1217 Alpha, entered a rapid descent from about 6,300 feet and impacted a marshy bay area about 41 miles southeast of the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas. The 2 pilots and 1 non-revenue jump seat pilot were fatally injured. The airplane was destroyed and highly fragmented. The airplane was on a scheduled flight from Miami, Florida to Houston. As the airplane approached the southeast coast of Texas, there was a small area of convective weather along the route of flight. The first officer was the pilot flying, and the crew discussed a deviation around the weather to the west. During the same time frame, the first officer had a display issue of some kind and temporarily transferred control to the captain until he cleared the problem using the EFI or FE switch, which selects source information for the electronic displays. The airplane was on a westerly vector around the weather, and ATC instructed the crew to expedite descent due to departure traffic. This graphically displays the flight path turning to the westerly vector to pass through the weather area. The accident site is marked by the red star. At 12:38, the airplane was descending on autopilot with speed brakes extended to assist in expediting the descent to 3,000 feet. Standard procedures recommend the pilot flying should be guarding the speed brake handle to prepare for retraction at level off. This positions the first officer's arm in close proximity to the go-around switch mounted on the left thrust lever. Captain Lawrence will discuss the activation of the go-around mode and subsequent crew actions in his presentation.
Now, a lot of people have focused on that accidental selection of go-around mode, but later you'll hear the chief investigator saying that that in itself wasn't significant. What was significant was how the crew reacted to what should have been a benign event. Here's part of the audio from an accident recreation video that I posted on my YouTube channel yesterday and which Patreon members are receiving, which explains what happened next.
We will show a short animation depicting the sequence of events. Note that the depictions are not necessarily identical to the airplane displays. In this still frame, you can see a simulated external view of the airplane, the analog airspeed indicator with digits to aid clarity, the main attitude director indicator including an airspeed tape display and artificial horizon. Here is a representation of the flight mode annunciator display, an analog altimeter, also with digits added for clarity, control yoke position, thrust levers, speed brake lever position, a profile graph, and select cockpit voice recorder transcript items. The crew was setting up the approach procedure when the airplane encountered light turbulence. Shortly afterward, the autopilot and auto throttles entered go-around mode as the airplane was passing about 6,300 feet. There were no flight crew callouts. Consistent with the activation of the go-around mode, the airplane arrested the descent and began a slight pitch-up, and the thrust levers advanced. The speed brakes were retracted, which could only be done manually. The captain responded to a routine radio call, while the first officer pushed forward on the column and made an expression about speed and exclaimed, "We're stalling." There was no indication that the airplane actually stalled. It was likely that the first officer was experiencing disorientation due to the somatographic illusion, in which airplane acceleration results in a false nose-high feeling. The airplane reached a steep nose-down attitude and high speed. Below about 3,000 feet, the airplane broke out of the clouds, the controls moved to full nose-up, but it was too late before they impacted the bay.
Now, there were many other factors that the NTSB explored, and here's a quick summary of them from an NTSB video.
Safety issues explored in this report include the inadvertent activation of go-around mode, the first officer's inappropriate response, and associated somatogravic illusion, the captain's delayed awareness of the abnormal situation, and his ineffective response, the first officer's employment history, as well as industry hiring process deficiencies, and the benefits of cockpit image recording devices.
The rest of these recordings are from the NTSB board meeting held earlier this week. This is Captain David Lawrence, who's a senior aviation safety investigator, talking about operational factors.
Good morning. I will discuss the inadvertent selection of go-around during the descent into Houston, the crew's response, the first officer's history of performance deficiencies, and pilot hiring and background checks. On the Boeing 767, the thrust levers and speed brake handle are located on the center pedestal between the captain's and first officer's seats. Two go-around switches are located just behind each thrust lever. Under normal operations, when the pilot wished to execute a go-around, he would use his thumb to press one of the two switches to engage the go-around mode for the autopilot and auto throttle. When the first officer was descending the airplane while using the speed brakes, standard operating procedures, or SOPs, require that his hand remain on the speed brake handle as a reminder to retract the speed brakes upon the autopilot's capture of the selected altitude and associated automatic increase in thrust. As shown in this depiction, holding the speed brake lever can place the left hand and wrist under the thrust levers and close to the left go-around switch, such that very little upward arm movement would be needed to make contact with the switch. Staff believes the go-around mode likely resulted from the unintended contact between the first officer's left wrist or watch and the left go-around switch due to turbulence-induced loads that moved his arm. This resulted in the unexpected transition of the autopilot to a go-around mode. Video imaging in the cockpit would have assisted in confirming the source of the go-around activation, and staff has proposed reiterating recommendations for the installation of cockpit image recorders. Although data suggests that this type of inadvertent activation of the go-around mode may be a rare or typically benign event, staff has proposed a recommendation to inform pilots of Boeing 767 series airplanes about the circumstances of this accident to increase their awareness of the possibility of inadvertently activating the go-around mode when manipulating or holding the speed brake lever. For reasons Dr. Bramble will discuss shortly, because the first officer was not effectively scanning his instruments, interpreting the information they provided, he experienced sensations which led him to incorrectly conclude that the airplane was stalling. While the airplane was not in a stall condition, the first officer's aggressive nose-down inputs and his failure to disconnect the autopilot and auto thrust were contrary to his training and Atlas Air SOPs for both a stall recovery or an unintended automation change. The first officer should have disconnected the automation and manually returned the airplane to its original profile. Instead, the first officer continued to make manual inputs that overrode the autopilot and forced the airplane into a steep dive that was unrecoverable. The first officer's apparent struggles with impulsive action during training scenarios at multiple employers suggest that he had an inability to remain calm during stressful situations. During the descent, as the captain was acting as pilot monitoring and setting up the approach and communicating with air traffic control, his attention was diverted from monitoring the airplane's state and verifying that the airplane was proceeding as planned. This delayed his recognition of and response to the first officer's unexpected actions to place the airplane in a dive. As pilot in command, the captain is directly responsible for and is the final authority on the operation of that aircraft. Despite having demonstrated an effective transfer of control several minutes earlier when the first officer had his display problem, the captain failed to assume positive control away from the first officer and arrest the airplane's descent, and instead began making manual control inputs simultaneously with the first officer that overrode the autopilot all the way to impact. The first officer had a history of training deficiencies and failed check rides. A review of the first officer's records showed that he repeatedly provided incomplete and inaccurate information about his past employment on resumes and applications he provided to multiple operators. For instance, he never disclosed to Atlas Air having worked for Commute Air and Air Wisconsin Airlines, and he attributed gaps in his employment history to college, furlough, and other non-airline work without mentioning his time spent at these two Part 121 carriers. These were deliberate attempts to conceal his history of performance deficiencies and deprived Atlas Air and other former employers of the information necessary to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. The Pilot Records Improvement Act, or PREA, requires a hiring operator to conduct a 5-year background check and evaluation of the prospective pilot. This check includes a review of known past employer records, FAA certification records, and a review of the National Drivers Registry, or NDR. Under PREA, operators like Atlas Air must rely on the applicant's honesty in disclosing information about their past. However, because of the deceptions on the first officer's resume and application, Atlas Air had an incomplete picture of his history of performance deficiencies and was unable to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. Further, Atlas Air relied on designated agents, or DAs, and human resource personnel for its initial review of records obtained under PREA instead of flight operations subject matter experts, and failed to notice the first officer's unsuccessful captain upgrade attempt at Mesa Airlines just prior to being hired at Atlas Air. The Pilot Records Database, or PRD, is currently in the rulemaking process and is designed to automate the manual PREA process. Staff has proposed multiple recommendations to ensure the PRD will include all background records necessary for a complete evaluation of a pilot's competency, and that those evaluations include flight operations experts at the carrier.
And next up is Dr. William Bramble, who has a PhD in psychology and is a senior human performance investigator discussing human performance. He gives an explanation of somatographic illusion. It occurs when a pilot is accelerated, leading to an incorrect perception of one's head tilting back, which could be interpreted as a pitch up or climb.
Good morning. I will discuss human performance issues in this accident. Changes to the autoflight system resulting from the first officer's inadvertent activation of go-around mode were displayed on flight mode annunciators in front of each pilot and on the engine indicating and crew alerting system in the center of the cockpit. The flight mode annunciators were located as shown on this slide at the top of the electronic attitude director indicator. Prior to activation of go-around mode, the system was in thrust hold, speed, heading select, and command modes, as shown in Figure A. After the activation, go-around or GA mode indications appeared at the top of the display, surrounded by green boxes, as shown in Figure B. 10 seconds after activation, these green boxes disappeared and the go-around mode indications remained, as shown in Figure C. Research indicates that pilots can miss displayed mode changes, particularly unexpected ones. In this case, the crew did not acknowledge the change to go-around mode, select a different mode, or at first verbalize that anything unexpected was happening. This indicates the crew lacked awareness of the mode change. The first officer expected the airplane to level off at 3,000 feet. When the airplane stopped descending, he retracted the speed brakes but did not otherwise react. This indicates that the first officer sensed a change in the airplane's state, assumed the airplane had reached the selected altitude, and reacted without fully assessing the situation. As forward acceleration increased, the first officer pushed forward on the control column, reducing the airplane's pitch, and he made nose-down column inputs consistent with a pitch-up or somatographic illusion. The inner ear senses linear acceleration as a result of shear and vestibular organs of the inner ear known as otoliths. In straight and level, unaccelerated flight, as depicted in Figure A, there is no shear and a sensation of being level. When the airplane is climbing at a constant speed, as shown in Figure B, there is aft shear due to gravity, and there is an accurate sensation of being tilted backwards. When the airplane is accelerating forward, as shown in Figure C, there is aft shear due to acceleration, and there is a false sensation of being nose high. This false sensation is the somatic gravic illusion. Under normal circumstances, the appearance of the outside visual scene allows us to ignore this sensation. But when outside visual references are limited and the flight instruments are not consistently monitored and correctly interpreted, spatial disorientation can occur. As the airplane dove and the crew became weightless in their seats, the first officer exclaimed, "Where's my speed?" and "We're stalling." The first officer's attention appears to have been fully absorbed by misleading sensations of motion that led him to incorrectly conclude that the airplane was stalling. As a result, he continued pushing forward on the control column. The captain's attention had been focused on setting up for the approach and communicating with air traffic control. This explains his delay in recognizing unexpected changes in airplane state resulting from the activation of go-round mode. The first officer's exclamations and the airplane's dramatic and unusual motions likely drew the captain's attention, but he did not promptly intervene. Research indicates such delays are common in cases of pilot subtle incapacitation. The captain likely experienced startle and surprise that reduced his performance. Flight data recorder evidence suggests that he pulled back on the column, but as Captain Lawrence stated, he did not announce a transfer of control. After the first officer said the airplane was stalling, the captain asked the first officer what was happening, but the first officer made only panicked exclamations. The captain's failure to assume positive control of the airplane and effectively arrest the airplane's descent likely resulted from the ambiguity, stress, and time-limited nature of the situation. Previous accidents involving transport category airplane pilots experiencing the somatic gravic illusion have occurred worldwide, resulting in hundreds of fatalities. These accidents have occurred in the United States, Bahrain, Russia, Libya, and Kazakhstan, and they indicate that somatic gravic illusion can be incapacitating for pilots. Investigations of past accidents have identified a variety of contributing factors and possible safety improvements. The U.S. Department of Defense has developed automatic ground collision avoidance technology for fighter aircraft that has prevented the loss of at least 7 F-16 aircraft. The DoD has begun researching the adaptation of this technology for the performance-limited Lockheed C-130, which it is estimated could save $385 million and 34 lives. The adaptation of existing auto GCAS systems to civil transport category airplanes could dramatically reduce spatial disorientation accidents involving the somatic gravic illusion. Staff has proposed a recommendation that the FAA convene a panel of aircraft performance, human factors, and aircraft operations experts to study the benefits and risks of adapting this technology for use in the civil sector.
I'm going to now play the NTSB's Probable Cause, as it may help you put the rest of the recordings in context. We'll be hearing Robert Zumwalt, who's a former airline pilot and chairman of the NTSB, read the proposed probable cause, including an amendment that he proposed that was included in the final probable cause. You'll note that his amendment holds the FAA partially responsible for the crash.
Thank you very much. I do have an amendment to the probable cause. Does anyone else have a proposed amendment? Okay, I'm going to make a motion. And my motion is, and by the way, this is exactly what was emailed out yesterday afternoon. My motion is to amend the probable cause as follows. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the inappropriate response by the first officer as the pilot flying to inadvertent activation of the go-around mode, which led to his spatial disorientation and nose-down control inputs that placed the airplane in a steep descent from which the crew did not recover. Contributing to the accident was the captain's failure to adequately monitor the airplane's flight path and assume positive control of the airplane to effectively intervene. Also contributing were systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry's selection and performance measurement practices, which failed to address the first officer's aptitude-related deficiencies, and maladaptive stress response. All of that I've just read should have been exactly as Mr. Curtis read. The part that I'm proposing to amend is this part here that states, also contributing to the accident was the Federal Aviation Administration's failure to implement the pilot records database in a sufficiently robust and timely manner. That is my motion. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Member Chapman seconds it. It's been moved and seconded. Discussion.
I've grouped the rest of the recordings into related topics. Let's first hear more about somatographic illusion. Now, I've written and presented a lot about somatographic illusion, and I even succeeded in getting the FAA to include it as a required oral check ride topic in the private PTS released in 2011, though for some reason they pulled it from the ACS version released a couple of years later. Well, despite what I knew about somatographic illusion, I was stunned to see that the NTSB calculated in this accident that the illusion felt to the pilots the same as a nose pitch-up attitude of 80 degrees or nearly straight up. So you can imagine if you didn't look at the instruments, your instinct would be to pitch forward very hard, which is why you always have to trust your instruments and not just rely on what you're feeling, as it can be wrong. Here's Chairman Sumwalt again.
Somatographic illusion, I've got about 37 seconds. Bill Bramble, is it your belief that this pitch up led him to believe that he had gone to as much as gave him the perception of about an 80 degree pitch up?
Yes.
Okay. So that would explain perhaps why he's saying we're stalling and things like that, because he perceives a drastic pitch up.
Next up is NTSB board member Michael Graham, who's a former Navy pilot, asking Dr. Bramble about somatographic illusion.
I'd like to ask some questions about sensory illusions out there. From the time the go-around switch was clicked on, it only took 32 seconds after that inadvertent activation for that aircraft, perfectly good aircraft, to be flown into the bay. We say it's largely due to the FO experience of somatographic illusion and the captain failing to assume positive transfer of control. At the time of the accident, the FO had an ATP certificate with several type ratings, or with a few of them, had accumulated over 5,000 hours of flying from 7 different employers. What kind of training for somatographic illusions or sensory illusions did the FO receive from Atlas?
No, I think Dr. Bramble should be able to expand on any type of unusual attitude or sensory illusion training.
Thank you.
I don't believe that the first officer received specialized training on somatographic illusions from Atlas. There is some attention to this and other types of illusions that can lead to spatial disorientation during basic instrument training and other phases of the pilot's training and certification.
Okay, so we don't think he probably didn't receive any kind of sensory illusion training from any of his training from any time at any of the airlines.
As far as I know, no, but I'll defer to Dave in case he knows anything additional about that.
No, there was not any specialized sensory training. Pilots, as was mentioned earlier, and Dr. Bramble emphasized, the instrument scan during instrument training is the most critical element to prevent this type of illusionary effect and succumbing to that.
Absolutely. So my next question is there any time during FAA licensing that you're required to have specific sensory illusion training that talks about all the different sensory illusion issues out there, like Coriolis effect, black hole approach, or in my case, black hole takeoff at an aircraft carrier, somatographic illusions, all those kind of things? Is there any time that a pilot is required to have specific training in sensory illusions prior to receiving a certificate?
Those items are included in basic instrument in the instrument ACS, now ACS, for early in a pilot's career. And if you mean physical training, no, this is largely academic training to learn about that. And then during unusual attitude training, early in gaining the initial instrument rating, you would get that sort of training. But as far as in a specific simulator or device, there's not a requirement for that that I know of in any rating. I think Dr. Bramble might be able to go further with that.
Yeah, as far as I know, what Mr. English is saying is accurate, and there's no requirement for them to have received the same type of training that you received in the Navy in Pensacola with the multi-station spatial disorientation demonstrator and the more in-depth classroom lectures about sensory illusions and spatial disorientation.
Correct. Thank you. Yeah, there's no requirement for a civil aviation pilot to receive specific training in these. I received some fantastic training in this in the Navy for obvious reasons. I was flying in a much more dynamic environment, and the military had lost many pilots in that environment, flying at night, and some of these illusions overwhelmed them, and unfortunately they lost their lives. So, we point out in this report that there have been previous accidents in transport category aircraft, 2 now in the U.S., several internationally with the airline operators. I asked our chief data scientist to look at the data that we have in our database here at the NTSB, and he found in the last 10 years from 2009 to 2018, and we have data on, that there were basically 219 accidents resulting in over 400 fatalities due to spatial disorientation. Now, granted, most of these, the vast majority of these were with GA pilots, but I think the industry would benefit from having additional training on these. I mean, we may not be able to get to the great devices that I got to witness these illusions in, but I've talked to civilian flight instructors that I know very well out there, and they don't really cover it on an instrument check ride or anything like that. It's just, recovery from unusual attitudes. They might talk about what might get you there, but you never get to feel it and witness it like I used to. So I would love to work with the staff in the weeks to come to look at the data and see if there's a good recommendation for training out there that we can do. And I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome, Member Graham. I had been flying for 25, 30 years before I'd ever even heard of somatographic illusion, and that's because it involved an accident involving my airline in 1994. So thank you.
Finally, Chairman Sumwalt asked how pilots can overcome somatographic illusion. Now say it with me, everyone. Trust your instruments.
How do we overcome spatial disorientation such as somatographic illusion?
Well, I think it's helpful if pilots know when to be on their guard for this type of illusion, such as during an intentional go-around, and if they have practice with instrument flying. In this case, I think the thing that was particularly tricky was that they would not have expected a rapid acceleration at this time, and they weren't aware of the mode change, so they were at a bit of a disadvantage there.
But would you say that it's true that by relying on your flight instruments is the way to overcome most spatial disorientation?
It's the only way to maintain accurate spatial orientation in these conditions.
I can imagine Member Graham shooting off the catapult of an aircraft carrier at night would have had to counter these tendencies throughout his Navy career. But I'm out of time. We will now go to the next round. Vice Chairman.
Now, weather should have been a minor factor, but in fact, a bump of turbulence may have been what started the ball rolling for this disaster.
I want to ask a question here. What was the effect of weather on this crash? I noticed that at a certain time on the CVR, on the FDR, there was about a 1.25 G loading on the aircraft, which was probably associated with going through what's known as a fine line or leading edge of cold front. And 13 seconds later is when the pitch down began. So what's the relationship, if any, between going through that weather and the pitch down?
I'll start that, and then we'll hand it to another few folks, because it while it's not an immediate effect, it certainly starts a lot of the ball rolling. As you mentioned, we had the small bit of turbulence entering the weather. They were not in any sort of severe weather. We did look very carefully to see if there was anything that could have physically affected the aircraft in a significant manner. We're looking at the turbulence as primarily the mechanism that probably jostled the FO's arm into the switch. And we can go back to Member Chapman's line of questioning. Image recorders would have helped us a lot with that, for sure. And then, of course, we assume that that was part of entry into the clouds as well, which with no outside visual references would certainly have contributed to the somatographic illusion of the first officer. I'll first hand it over to Mr. Richards, our meteorology specialist, to.
No,
you don't want to look at that further.
We don't need a weather briefing, but I did want to ask that because there was a lot going on in this cockpit over a short period of time. But it does sound plausible that what you've just said there is that it was 6 seconds from this 1.25 G to the go-around switch activation. So it sounds to me like you said, like we said earlier on, he's guarding the speed brake with his hand reaching over, and somehow or another, the turbulence may have jostled his wrist so that he activates the go-around switch. So I wanted to get that out there.
Now we have several clips on some of the flight dynamics involved. Let's start with member Bruce Landsberg, who I've presented with in the past. He's the former head of AOPA's Air Safety Institute. He asked about a number of issues, starting with a stick shaker, which in jets notifies pilots they're approaching a stall by vibrating the yoke or stick.
I want to go back to the cockpit here a little bit, following up on some of the questions that Member Graham asked. After encountering the light turbulence, as near as we can tell, and from the leading edge of the weather, we believe that the first officer's arm inadvertently triggered the left go-around switch. So just to confirm, Captain Lawrence, the stick shaker and stick pusher did not activate at any time during the flight, and the speed and pitch attitude were not indicative of a stall. Do I have that correct?
You're correct.
So I'm, as a pilot myself, like some of the others on our board here, I shake my head at, how this could happen, but I think we're starting to find that. As the flight was approaching the area of turbulence, the first officer called for flap extension. Now, flap extension lowers the gust tolerances of all aircraft, and additionally, both Boeing and Atlas recommend that flaps not be extended until you're much closer to the airport. And had the flaps not been extended, then it's my understanding that the go-around mode would not have been able to be activated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So do we have any theory as to why the first officer called for flaps so far from the airport, one, and then two, because the captain was acting as sort of the second, why the captain said, wait a minute, let's hold off a little on the flaps?
We don't know exactly why he decided to lower the flaps that far out. It could have been his effort to increase the drag, because that was the time when he was expediting the descent down to 3,000 feet. It could have been that effort to increase drag to get down a little bit faster, maybe also in anticipation at the level off of 3,000 feet that he was going to start slowing the aircraft to allow a little bit more spacing or time for the captain to program the FMC. They never verbalized any reason why they did it, so we just can't surmise what their process was on lowering the flaps.
Okay. One of the things that a lot of transport category aircraft have is a pitch limit indicator. Could you describe the role of that?
Right. The pitch limit indicator are little eyebrows that appear or will appear on the attitude director indicator. And they are basically an indication of what the pitch will be when you get a stick shaker. That system is part of the stall warning system, and it becomes available once you select flaps. However, it doesn't just magically appear on the attitude director indicator as soon as you select flaps. you have to get up to a pitch level where you're starting to approach the angle of attack of stall, and then those PLIs will become visible.
So there really is a lot of guidance built into these airplanes as to let pilots know if you're approaching a stall or whatever. This is as high as your pitch attitude can reasonably go under those circumstances. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would the pitch limit indicator have been visible to the captain and the first officer in the accident flight configuration?
Likely not, because the pitch, you didn't get up until about 4 or 5 degrees, and it wasn't anywhere near the angle of attack, so the PLIs wouldn't have come. And then, of course, once they nosed over, it wouldn't have been near the angle of attack or stick shaker speed.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue to my next question. The pitch attitude change from descent to go around, if I remember correctly, we were about 1 degree nose low in the descent. And in go around, the aircraft pitched up to about 4 degrees nose up, which to me doesn't seem like very much. How does that comport? I mean, it just doesn't seem like the aircraft is anywhere close to stalling. And so now we throw in the acceleration as the thrust levers come up. Is this what caused the first officer's somatographic problems?
I'll defer to Dr. Bramble on that.
Okay, thank you.
So initially, when the go-around mode activated, it triggered the thrust to begin increasing, but it took a few seconds for that to happen. And as that occurred, the reactive inertial force combined with the effects of gravity caused the gravity inertial force angle to shift. And that is what caused the first officer to begin feeling as if the airplane was pitching up more than 4 or 5 degrees.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You might be wondering just how big the sensation was of transitioning from a descent to having the go-around mode activate and start a climb. This is Bill English speaking.
It's also important to note, however, that when go-around mode was activated, where we think accidentally by bumping the switch, I don't want people to take away the impression that this turned the airplane into a bucking bronco. It basically was leveling off. Things like that could happen for a multitude of reasons. Someone could have entered the wrong altitude in the altitude pre-select, could have accidentally entered something wrong in the FMS profile descent. There was plenty of time to take a look at the airplane and say, something's not right here, well before the airplane was in any sort of extreme situation. It was the extreme reaction to the situation that's the problem, more so than the particular item itself. I think I want to make sure that that's clear.
Bill also makes a point that the inadvertent selection of go-around mode normally isn't a big deal if pilots respond correctly and follow their standard operating procedures.
Once again, the go-around mode activation in and of itself is not the major problem with this accident scenario. It happened if you do absolutely nothing following the activation of that switch. The airplane transitions into a 2,000 foot per minute climb. It would have been little more than an altitude bust. Yeah. So the reaction to the slightly abnormal situation was the problem. So I wouldn't want us to focus too much on the specifics that it was go-around mode. And I think Dr. Bramble can elaborate on some history of oral alerts and alerting science in transport category aircraft.
Fair enough. Thanks.
And now let's turn our focus to the first officer, starting with NTSB board member Jennifer Hammondy, who asked about deficiencies in his training. She first echoes something Chairman Sumwalt said earlier in the day, which is that it may be hard for family members to hear these things about the pilots, but the reason we talk about pilots and accidents is so we can learn from mistakes and hopefully save the lives of others in the future.
Thank you. I just want to, first, let me just take a couple of seconds. I just want to echo something that the chairman earlier said in his opening statement. I know that there are families of the flight crew that are listening. I'm going to ask some tough questions, and those questions and answers may be difficult to hear, but I want you to know that I'm not asking them to focus on any one individual, but to highlight some serious safety deficiencies that led to this accident. So with that, I do want to talk, Mr. Lawrence, about the background a little bit more, which the chairman talked about in his questions. So in 2011, for purposes of public who are watching, in 2011, he goes to work for Commute Air. This wouldn't have been on his PREA records check. The first officer withheld that information on his resume to Atlas, so Atlas didn't know about it. He had some training deficiencies. I did notice some inconsistencies in his questionnaire that was completed for Commute Air, which asked under PREA, do you have any training or disciplinary concerns that we should be aware of? In a 2010 response to Commute Air, he said yes. In 2011, his response to Commute Air was no. And you might be able to say that that could be an anomaly, but his answers to other questions were very consistent between the two. He resigns after 2 months, goes to Air Wisconsin. The FO withheld that information about Air Wisconsin, not just from Atlas, but also from TransStates, correct? And so Atlas wasn't aware of it. He had some training difficulties at Air Wisconsin, resigns due to personal reasons, goes to Charter Air Transport, then to TransStates, where there are numerous training deficiencies. He failed his oral, failed his check ride, was graded unsatisfactory on a line check, and after 6 months resigns. He does tell Atlas about this on his application, which I have. Have you ever failed an initial upgrade transition or current proficiency check? He says yes. In your questioning, they are fully aware of it, but blow it off due to personal reasons. What is interesting to me is that he did not disclose that he also had a failed upgrade at Mesa, which is what I want to ask about. So he did try to upgrade to captain 2 months before Atlas hired him, and he was returned to the line as an FO. That was not disclosed in his application, and Atlas relied on a designated agent to do their PREA records check. The designated agent returns the PREA information, which I have. And under Mesa Air, it says no derogatory information on file for performance, no disciplinary actions reported. The full report has been uploaded to regulatory documents. But then if they had opened the regulatory documents, I wonder what they would have seen, because it said 9 times per email he was returning to FO, per email he was returning to FO, per email he was returning to FO. I could say that 9 times, but I'm not going to. Why didn't they look at that? Why didn't Atlas look at that?
Well, for the upgrade on the Mesa, that information, you're right, he didn't disclose that he didn't complete the upgrade, but the information was there. And the problem was, and we cite this in a finding in the report, that they relied on the designated agent to identify these red flags. What are the red flags in this pilot's background that you should look a little bit further in? But the problem with the designated agent relying on them is they may or may not have aviation background. Their only requirement is to understand the PREA law and apply the law and go get those records. It's still up to the operator to do the complete evaluation. So that was the problem Atlas had. They relied on the DA to identify these red flags, and that's an inappropriate way to try and do the evaluation.
Okay, great. And in this situation, the person wasn't a pilot, and Atlas had, they said in hindsight, would have liked to ask about it.
Oh.
Whose responsibility is it? My time is up. Last question. Whose responsibility is it at the end of the day to look at that training record and know what's in there? Is it the designated agent or is it Atlas?
It is the hiring carrier's responsibility to look at the records and do the evaluation of his background.
Next, Dr. William Bramble talks more about the first officer.
The first officer's performance and training demonstrated that when given enough practice, he was able to perform highly proceduralized actions, but he became overwhelmed when confronted with novel, complex, or unexpected situations. Atlas instructors attributed his difficulties to external circumstances or low confidence. However, his long history of significant performance difficulties is indicative of low aviation aptitude. To mitigate the risk of hiring pilots with unsuitable characteristics, airlines need a systematic, scientifically based approach to pilot selection that assesses relevant pilot characteristics and collects enhanced pilot performance data to validate selection measures and establish appropriate cutoff scores. Airlines would benefit from a collaborative effort that allows them to pool data and share best practices in this area. Staff has proposed a recommendation that the FAA establish a clearinghouse of pilot selection data to help operators improve and validate pilot selection strategies. This concludes my presentation.
And next, Chairman Sumwalt goes deeper into the first officer's history.
Let me just say that as a pilot myself, I realize that any pilot can fail a check ride on any given day. We're not looking for one single failure. It's when we have a history of repeated failures that becomes perhaps a predictor of future performance. And I know that sounds cruel, but the fact is we've got a record going back 30 years with 10 accidents, at least 10 accidents where pilots have had performance issues and they go on to crash an airplane. Now, let me point out a couple of things here. On 2 occasions, this first officer failed to disclose hiring to the hiring airline that he did not complete training for 2 other airlines. Is that correct, Captain Lawrence?
You are correct, Chairman.
Now, let's put a fine point on his training record. In 2011, he did not complete training at Commute Air, and he resigned due to a lack of progress. At Air Wisconsin, he did not complete training. He resigned for personal reasons. When he got to Air Trans-States, he failed an oral exam. He failed an ATP check ride, and he had an unsat on a line check. And he resigned for personal reasons. At Mesa, he failed to upgrade to captain on a plane that he had been flying as a first officer. He resigned to take the job at Atlas. And at Atlas, he was not recommended for his 767 oral. He was not recommended to proceed to the full flight simulator until he had additional time. He had trouble in the 767 full flight simulator. After the second session, his simulator partner was complaining that the first officer was holding him back. And then he failed his first type rating check ride on the 767. Collectively, Captain Lawrence, what might all of this indicate to you as an experienced airline captain?
Well, in the aggregate, with an evaluation of his entire training history, it would obviously say that this pilot has some difficulties in the airline operations, and his competency could be questioned. It would be warranting more evaluation and asking. The problem we found here with Atlas is that by him not disclosing those 2 carriers, Atlas really only saw one practical test failure in his background. And as you pointed out, airlines before COVID were hiring pilots with at least a single check ride failure in their background all the time.
Thank you. Before Atlas, of the 6 airlines that this first officer worked for, he had documented proficiency problems at 4 of them.
Correct.
And next, Captain David Lawrence responds to a question asked by member Graham about what the first officer's former instructor pilots said about his abilities and skills.
I think the one instructor from Mesa, made mention that his training was a train wreck, I believe is the quote. And their input on this pilot's training was consistent with what we heard with Trans-States and what we heard eventually with Atlas, that the pilot had a propensity to panic and start doing things in the cockpit that were inappropriate and start pushing buttons. And The Mesa pilot also said that, or check airman said that this pilot, in her words, had weak stick and rudder skills as well.
You bet. Thank you. Yeah, if people are interested in that, I really recommend they go out to the docket. It is quite eye-opening. My concern here is the pilot was allowed to continue as a pilot with all the deficiencies that a basic pilot should not have. I am absolutely miffed why this pilot was allowed to continue in the cockpit. At some point, one of these training review boards or companies should have pulled this FO from the cockpit. As a former instructor pilot in the Navy, I was also a training officer for a couple of years, and I had the unenviable task of having to inform a few pilots that their flying careers were over because of, consistent lack of airmanship skills, unsafe acts, poor judgment, poor decision making, continuously being behind the aircraft, and constant lack of situational awareness. It wasn't anything I enjoyed doing, but it was required to put the pilot and the operation, not put the pilot and the operation at additional risk. I can't believe Mesa or another one of these operators out there didn't stop this and recommend this first officer have another career other than being a pilot. This should be a wake-up call to the industry. I'm a firm believer that an operation is only as good as its weakest player. If you have people that can't perform up to the minimum standard, have continued training and performance issues, or can't upgrade, I would hope you would take a good hard look at these people and determine, can we get them up to the minimum standard with additional training? Or do we pull them from the cockpit because they put themselves, the operation, and the public at unacceptable risk? I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And next, Chairman Sumwalt talks about how the first officer would respond by pushing lots of buttons when he encountered a problem. And I see some general aviation pilots do that as well, especially with the autopilot, and it drives me crazy because it's the wrong thing to do and it gets you into even more trouble. The right thing to do is to learn everything there is to know about your autopilot. Then you can deliberately push the correct one or two buttons that you know will solve the problem. I think a lot of people are used to punching lots of buttons on their smartphone to try to figure out how to make it work. But in an airplane, that's not a safe thing to do. And of course, the right thing to do when you have an automation surprise is to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the airplane.
I want to see if you see a trend here. At Mesa, the check airman said that when the first officer was presented with something unexpected in the simulator, the first officer would get extremely flustered and could not respond appropriately to the situation. When he didn't know what to do, he would become extremely anxious and would start pushing a lot of buttons without thinking about what he was pushing, just to be doing something. And at Atlas, when he busted his first check ride there, the examiner told the NTSB that when the first officer realized that he needed to do something, he often did something inappropriate, like push the wrong button. Here's two different airlines talking about the same person, and they're using almost exactly the same verbiage. Would you say that this behavior that was described at each of these airlines was seen in this accident flight?
We saw the same similarities. In fact, it wasn't just Atlas. It was Air Wisconsin. A check airman from Air Wisconsin had the same identical concerns. The check airman that provided his upgrade training at Mesa said the same thing, that Atlas was. So there was a consistency that this pilot tended to do things when in a stressful situation, just do anything, and start pushing buttons. And it was consistent through all these airlines.
Do you agree with what I said earlier, that a repeated history of failures could be a predictor of future performance?
Absolutely, and that's exactly why pilots or airlines want to do a screening to find the full history and obtain that pattern.
Although much of the focus during the board meeting was the first officer, the captain was also at fault, and Member Landsberg asked how much time there was to fix things if the captain had intervened correctly.
Recognizing again, this was a tough situation. Do we have any estimate as to how much time the captain might have had to intervene before this became unrecoverable and an altitude or something like that, that they might have been able to recover?
Right. I'll defer that to Mr. English.
Yes, Vice Chairman Landsberg. While we don't know precisely the point where the airplane could be recoverable, from the beginning of the anomaly where the go-around mode was activated through to the point where the airplane still hadn't deviated from that 6,000 foot altitude very much, the captain had about 20 seconds or so to notice first the inappropriate, the mode change and the level off, which was one opportunity to intervene before the airplane started to become extreme. And then if you remember where the throttles went back and forth, that was about 20 seconds or so into the event. And at that point, the aircraft had not yet started the very steep descent. And there was probably some amount of time after that where still a correct intervention could have changed the situation.
So roughly about 20 seconds, they likely would have been able to recover.
Maybe a little more, but that's a good estimate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Now, the accident happened very quickly. The final plunge took just 30 seconds, and it was a mere 3 minutes earlier that all was calm and peaceful in the cockpit. Here's Chairman Sumwalt.
But there was a lot going on in a short period of time. In fact, there was 3 minutes from calm to catastrophe. There was a culmination of several things that came together. And I won't put the times here, but the first officer transferred controls at 12:36:09.9. I said I wouldn't mention the times, but that's when it all starts, when all of these events started. Then there was a discussion in the cockpit about weather. Then they're cleared to 3,000 feet. ATC then says expedite down to 3,000 feet. He says hustle on down to 3,000 feet. That's when the first officer probably decides, oh, I need to get the flaps out, at least go to flaps 1 to increase my descent rate. But when ATC says expedite descent, they don't mean you have to dive down to the ground. And I don't mean that literally in this particular case. But okay, then the first officer remarks about holding off on a checklist. Then the first officer remarks about his EFI button fixing everything. Then ATC gives them a heading to 270 degrees. And they transfer control back to the first officer. 10 seconds of conversation about setting up the FMS. Then the first officer calls flaps 1, which of course, as we now know, arms the go-around mode. 12 seconds of discussion about the FMS, setting up the FMS and the flight mode panel. Then they go through the little turbulence area, which leads to the go-around activation, and then the beginning of the pitch down. So there was a lot going on here, but probably the salient events were going through the turbulence, expediting the descent. He grabs the speed brake, puts out the flaps, which arms the go-around mode. That then causes him to accidentally hit the go-around switch.
There was another topic discussed at length during the board meeting that we won't go into detail about, as this show is focused on general aviation, and that is about the Pilot Records Improvement Act, or PREA, used by the airlines to find out the history of the new pilots they're hiring, and about the pilot record database that the FAA is still working on. This is Chairman Sumwalt talking in 2 separate clips that I'll run back to back about holes in the PREA safety net, and this should give you a small flavor for the topic.
I want to talk briefly. I've only got 55 seconds. I want to talk briefly about holes in the safety net, and that's holes in the PREA safety net. You know, Atlas could have known about this information if the FAA had developed a sufficiently robust pilot records database as called for by Congress. And as Member Chapman pointed out, Colgan Air was in 2009. In 2010, we made recommendations about to fill those holes in the pilot hiring or the pilot records database. Congress mandated pilot record database in 2010. The FAA started an aviation rulemaking committee in 2011. That committee reported out to the FAA their findings in 2011. In 2015, the FAA began a phased-in approach to the pilot records database. And as you pointed out, Member Chapman, Congress set a deadline of April the 30th of 2017. Hey, that deadline's come and gone. They finally issued an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, in March of this year, and the FAA indicates that at the very best, it will take them until sometime 2021 to get that pilot records database in full force. That means that it's going to take a 2-year phase-in period. That means at best, it's going to be 2023 before we have a fully robust pilot records database. So it's 14 years after Colgan Air, 13 years after the NTSB's recommendations for this, 13 years after Congress mandated, 5 years after the initial deadline posed by Congress, and 4 years after this tragic accident that we're here talking about today. The FAA has dragged their feet on implementing a sufficiently robust pilot records database. So with that, I'm over time. Vice Chairman, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think most of us echo your feelings of frustration. This is not exactly the FAA's finest hour.
Member Chapman, I think I saw something that you wrote yesterday that the FAA has something like, 46,000 employees at an $18 billion budget or something. What are those figures?
Yeah, it's 46,000 employees and an $18 billion budget. This seems like something that an agency with that kind of resources should be able to accomplish in less than 13 years.
I agree. And one of the things I did not mention in my timeline is that I think when the initial legislation was passed, the Congress, they appropriated, I should say, the FAA $6 million a year for 4 years to get this done. So you would think with $18 billion and 46,000 employees, you'd think that somebody over there could get this thing done. So we'll leave it at that. I know that staff does not necessarily concur with this notion of adding the FAA. I appreciate very much that we get different viewpoints, and I think it's through that process that we get a better product and that we're not missing something and that we're not having groupthink.
So here are 5 key takeaways for GA pilots. Number 1, know all of your autopilot functions and how to quickly determine what mode it's in. In modern glass cockpits like the G1000 and G3000, look for the autopilot's scoreboard at the top of the PFD. 2, automation surprises happen. When they do, follow the industry standard, which is to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the aircraft. 3, if the pilot flying is having trouble flying and they're not fixing it, do a positive exchange of the controls and start by saying, I have the controls or I have the airplane. You should never have 2 people trying to fly the plane at the same time. Number 4, trust your instruments when you're in the clouds or at night. Never rely on how you feel, as that can be wrong. Remember, trust your instruments, not your feelings. And finally, flying is not for everyone, and that's okay. If you failed a number of check rides, maybe you need a new instructor, or maybe flying isn't for you. And number 6, if you've been thinking, yeah, I'd really like to support Max and all he does for aviation through the Aviation News Talk podcast, then what are you waiting for? Everyone who donates gets their name read on the show, and depending upon what level you sign up at, you may receive the scripts to our news shows, links to the many news stories we had to cut for time, free access to my online courses, and at the $50 a month level, I'll read your name on every news show and send you a signed copy of one of my books after 2 months. If you'd like to receive all those goodies, then you'll need to sign up through Patreon to make a monthly donation. To do that, go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and enter your credit card information. You can also support the show through PayPal, and their system gives you a choice of either donating monthly or making a one-time lump sum donation. Now, if you sign up via PayPal, I don't have a way to get the show notes to you, but you can still get the free online courses and books that I offer at the $35 and $50 a month level. And to donate via PayPal, go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And thank you so much for your support. And finally, please tell all of your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated app for free. Just search in the store for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, Have fun and keep the blue side up.